That's a problem of ours. So for the slow long-term growth, I would say, and then we can explain it afterward. Problem of product space or product complexity. You know, this more economic. Problem of education capacity related to the first one. And then, for the second one,
well, your product space is composed with what?
70% agriculture.
And you grow what? What
Commodities, vanilla, vanilla.
Vanilla?
Madagascar is the first producer of vanilla.
Okay.
Producer of vanilla. You did it. Not me. And textile product. So agriculture, so vanilla, mainly vanilla, coffee,
but nonetheless, tropical agriculture.
yeah, tropical agriculture, textile, and fishery product. Okay.
But it's worth putting their textiles and then garments. So looking at the product space, like you
Yeah.
get a lot more out of actually producing the finished product rather than just cloth.
Yeah.
Then
And
your
slow growth, and then the cyclical political crisis. This is related to institution. The state institution and social
weak
institution.
institution.
Yeah.
Okay.
Might be also geography.
Okay. So one question, what is your
So
saving rate?
what is
Your
the
saving
binding
rate.
constraint?
Your saving
One.
Wait, let's tell us is binding.
What is the priority?
I don't know.
Yeah. And all of these, like across the periods, the product complexity, education, are they equally important? Would you say that there was?
I don't know. I'm not an artist. I'm not a political artist.
That's why I was asking.
That's why I'm telling you I need maybe 1 week to think and dream about it.
End up to the binding one. How to rate it? How to put 50%, 30%,
And then here there was a,
5%, and
I was
And
a member of the
Yeah,
government
it's
here.
your argument, right? I mean, he's listed like 5, 6 out of like potentially hundreds, right? And then you kind of talk through each of them. Well, it's a very open-ended paper too. It's not really asking.
There was a
for like-
strong growth here. I was a member of the
It's not,
government.
yeah.
Bro,
strong one?
when
There
he
was a
in
strong
government.
growth
Yes,
here.
of course.
The tendency here was really growing. And afterwards, there was the political.
I
Okay,
remember that
okay.
at that time you were minister. At that time you were
At
minister.
that time I was minister.
So basically,
guess
the
we've
problem
never
is
been
the
in their
opposition
hands.
party
Yeah.
that took over. Yeah. But okay, so I don't think we've answered all the questions yet that were talking
The
about.
saving
So
rate,
kind
the
of
property,
narrow-
the property
Saving
rights.
rate.
Are you trying to waste time?
Those are details,
Saving
please.
rate,
Those are
property
details.
Why don't we start
Those are
conversation about the
Those are
US?
details. No, we can show it.
I think we should also narrow in on some of the questions that are asked in the assignment. So, like you helpfully graph that as GDP per capita, but we should also look closer at factors like population growth and savings rate to see do they help us find which constraints.
Yeah,
ideally what your
okay.
presentation would be
Demography.
right.
Here,
But I would also say, like,
it might be related to the first, to this first observation, might be also demography. But, since 1990s, we entered the demography, demography. So efficient.
No, sorry.
So slowly. So it's not an issue anymore for demography. We saw it in the first assignment. We entered the demography transition.
But that's
It's not an issue anymore here, starting here.
correct. Because you crossed that,
Yeah,
straight
yeah.
up,
I mean,
so-
we are moving. We are moving.
But what about, is there a window? When was your window of opportunity?
Now? The window for opportunities right now.
Okay, so that's where kind of bringing the demographic.
Yeah,
So that
that's
is a
why
very
I'm
big
here.
point, right? Like when
Yeah,
there's this, So it is now for the next, decade or so, that you have many more working age population.
Until
versus-
2030, yeah.
So this at least illustrates an idea. Like you want to have like these 7 or 8 things that we've gone through. These elements come in your analysis. You'll have about 10 to 15 slides. say, spend about half the slides at least laying this out. I mean, there's tricks with PowerPoint. You can lay out all four, can lay out 4 things on one slide if you want to spend more time on the discussion. But this checklist will help as a start. And then each of these, if you want to talk just about modern, the thought is that you'll have some point of view as to, forget saying my #1 binding constraint is this, or that this is 72%, but just that what do you feel like if you were Prime Minister, President, whatever, like how would you think about prioritizing, and then kind of get feedback from the class, does that make sense? And the class gets feedback from you. Yeah? Yeah. Can we do like just for a few minutes, like I mean US too, like the growth has slowed down, right? Let's hear. We have this on video. We started this before you.
Okay, so this is just data from memory, right? Like, I'm in the Madagascar group. I don't know anything about the U.S. except for last year.
Jeff, where are you from?
New York.
Oh, New York. Okay, these are San Francisco guys.
Right. You're from San Francisco?
I am.
Okay. All right. Well,
Coast to
so we'll
coast.
skip the flyover state, so we'll tell you about the coastal. Yeah.
Well, so the broadest trends of the United States economy are our GDP per capita has been rising remarkably steadily, essentially throughout our nation's history, but in the relevant time period, it's been rising steadily with the exception of relatively brief recessions, much like the one we just emerged from, or are emerging from.
80s, early 2000s, 2008.
Exactly. Those
are very serious ones, though.
Yeah, those are sort of the big 3 moments where there was either stagnation or decline in GDP per capita. Otherwise, it's been a steady increase. Savings rate over time has decreased since the 1980s. And it's hard exactly to say why that is.
No, it's kind of leveled
But
out.
it essentially savings rate basically fell off a cliff in the early 1980s and has been continually declining until very recently when there's been a slight uptick in the savings rate.
What is this? Please lay out, yeah.
When you talk about savings, is it like household savings?
Yeah, the household savings rate.
Which is best captured through like a bank, like a lending rate, right? You have to pick like, there's a whole bunch of benchmarks.
Yeah, there's different metrics for it.
And try and give numbers too, so when you say the savings rate is low now, I mean,
Yeah.
what are those numbers?
I have no idea.
Yeah, well,
I don't have that in memory.
is that correct? It is,
I think bank rates are like, but then household saving rates, yeah, then the like macro numbers you can easily.
yeah, so credit has expanded greatly. Right? For short-term credit, which is probably the single biggest factor that, I mean, if you're looking at the macroeconomic picture of the U.S., and I think if you're looking at like current account deficits related numbers, probably the short-term credit markets have been the biggest problem in the U.S. and a lack of savings, correct? I mean, when you have short-term credit, a current account situation, it's fine to run a deficit, right? It's okay, it just depends on what that deficit is comprised of. I think generally with the U.S., if you're to look at, like, foreign direct investment has been very strong, so that's okay to run that kind of.
Well, I mean, it's very debatable whether there's
Yeah.
deficit.
Yeah.
Well,
There's a
I'll
thing,
throw
it's
something
like-
out there. For the viewers at home, we didn't coordinate this in advance. I have no preparation for this, but also, in my view, I think one of the problems for continued growth is what actually keeps you growing inequality. So GDP per capita shows strong growth from the 80s onwards, but actual household income, real household income has been stagnant for 30 years. So where's that extra GDP going? It's actually going to the higher income brackets. And,
Yep, it's a wealth transfer.
Right, and so the wealthier are getting wealthier, but the mainstream population income are actually stagnating, and the ranks of the poor have actually grown somewhat, apart from recessions and the recent crisis. So that actually puts a drag on household consumption and savings. So as household income remains stagnant, if consumption is to keep growing, then people are borrowing, not saving. Or consumption is not growing, and 70% of the economy is actually household consumption. So I think that the growing inequality, which I'm not sure what explains that, but that's a drag on.
Is that the case? I thought that the per capita income has been much higher than inflation. And
Real per capita income is grown, but per capita income is just division, right? This
Yeah.
doesn't actually explain actual household
Well-
income trends. So if you look at real household income has actually been stagnant among the middle class. So where is that extra GDP gone? It's gone to the upper income bracket.
But how?
the per capita still goes up. But you're saying the distribution is, because you will see a higher per
But
capita
also-
which is going to the.
But
Yeah,
there's a
also
difference between per
inflation.
capita and household income, right? So per capita income is not anyone's actual data. It's just the total income divided by the
Yeah.
population. But if you look at household income, which is basically gathered from tax returns, the actual income of households is not rising. Just,
So,
yeah.
how much?
So the real household income is stagnant. I mean, you can Google this, there are lots of studies that show this. And then what's explained there is then growing inequality.
How much of it is accounted for by the fact that there have been immigrants, an influx of immigrants over the last decade or so? Because you can make the argument that the households who were at one point seeing their income increase aren't seeing their income increase versus there's new people coming into the US who are extremely impoverished and extremely ill. So
That's a good point.
What's the difference?
No, I mean, I don't have that much data, and like I said, I didn't prepare for this at all. So, but I think that's a good question, so that, maybe actually people do experience significant social mobility, but then there are other people coming in that are actually poorer, and that brings the overall average down.
Well, just to, I want to raise this question of, the transfer of wealth, and why is that happening? And I think obviously if we knew all the answers to that, it would be better shape. I mean, what, do you guys have thoughts on what, aside from the Wall Street crisis and lack of regulation, and I mean, clearly there are institutional control problems that have, deregulation over the last two administrations I would cite as a huge problem, obviously.
And regressive taxation.
Regressive taxation, right, and not taxing enough for the rich, I guess.
So if you were doing this,
No, I just want to ask
Okay.
you, yesterday I went to see a guy that he's the responsible of the education system in Chicago. He mentioned that all the state of Illinois is bankrupt.
It's because they stole all their money.
Yeah.
Chicago,
Yeah.
come on.
No, but I,
Yeah.
so for, some people asked him, the federal government should intervene and maybe should bring more resources. They are broke.
I can tell
also.
you, we as New York are not giving any more money to Chicago.
No.
Forget about it.
Yeah.
No, okay, so forget about Chicago, but my question is that, do you think, and I know that you are not prepared, but I'm interested to know your opinion, do you think that maybe the external debt, the growing external debt, it's a binding constraint, it's the most important issue that
The growing national debt is the biggest issue? I don't think so.
The 14 trillion, how much is it?
I don't think it's.
The U.S. is too powerful. I mean, the U.S. can rack up all the debt at once, and because it's so intertwined with every other economy of the world, right? It's not necessarily a good thing.
But yeah, I would argue that I don't think countries are ever going to stop allowing the United States to take on increasing amounts of debt. In part, maybe they will. This is something that everyone disagrees about.
China may change its rules, but
If I were to tentatively suggest a possible binding constraint that is somewhat related to what we've been discussing, the demographics of the United States are very different right now than what they've been for most of this period of fairly robust growth that we've seen. So one thing that I would point to as a possible alternative for the binding constraint is that people like me are going to be, it's a much smaller pool than the current class of emerging retirees, which means that because of the way the United States social welfare and retirement system is run, there will be this huge disconnect between the amount of funding needed for retirement and the amount of funding going into the United States government in the form of taxation from current employment productivity.
So I have a question.
And-
I mean,
it's
on that.
freezing it as a window of opportunity.
Well, that's,
where
yeah.
you are.
Yeah.
I want to add on that and
Exactly.
say that there was a demographic dividend that the U.S. went through for the last half century.
Yeah.
Tremendous growth from like 1930 after the Depression to current day. But that time, that window is now closing very rapidly. We've got a baby boomer generation that was extremely productive, has made a ridiculous amount of money. And so the disparity between our generation, well, we're just,
That's okay.
You're Y, I'm X, I don't know, or Z, I don't know, but we're not that far apart.
Yeah, well,
but,
It's a 5 year.
Yeah, only
but
like
the
a
truth
2x.
is, the disparity from like our parents, Jeff.
Speak for yourself.
Anyway, so bottom line is,
Your grandfather.
it's a tremendous disparity in the amount of wealth that one can gather in this generation going forward versus the line. It is just night and day,
So-
and it's getting much worse.
considering you guys have outlined that as a problem, I mean, this is something that's really interesting for me because in the U.S. media and U.S. academic circles, austerity gets lashed out at so much that it's insane. But do you guys see any other measure but austerity going forward for the United States? Because I mean, do you see growth happening and you guys meeting the targets you have with with Medicare, Medicaid, and the social welfare system, like without austerity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think austerity is really linked to growth in a positive relation, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
austerity might be
definitely.
necessary for other reasons, but austerity is considered to constrain growth.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Don't you think that that is necessary for sustainability?
Austerity
No.
on the government's part or on consumption?
Well, yeah, I mean, austerity is a fiscal policy. Right, I mean, I think that's a very active current debate, but no, I think austerity is a mistake, and what we actually need is more stimulus, and we're still in a liquidity trap. We're still in a deleveraging cycle, so.
More stimulus?
No,
Right.
we're not even
I
close
mean,
to being done with.
Right, I mean, I think
liquidity trap.
the stimulus that was done in 2009, I think, was probably very inefficient, and it was also very large. I don't think we either need a stimulus that large, but we need one that's more efficient and targeted, that more
Well,
relevant.
here's one problem. On the liquidity, I think the liquidity crisis is the crisis that's left. There's still a drop that the U.S. is going to
What
experience.
do you
And
think about this issue of the
I think
middle
Alexis
income
was
in the
talking.
country? The middle income in America now, like disappear. What would you
It's
say about
disappearing, it's not disappearing.
It's not disappearing, but
It's
it is
under pressure, and
under
it's
tremendous
not
pressure.
growing. So, I mean, I think that, you know, among the major problems would be improving the taxation system, both making federal taxes more progressive and lightening the burden on the middle class, but also there's a huge problem that taxation here is so complicated, and education is driven by school taxes paid on property at the local level. This is probably not fixable, given the nature of the system in America, but that's a really regressive and inefficient system that would help to fix. Giving more money to Chicago wouldn't be a good idea. But the only other thing I want to say about growth is that growth in America is generally driven by innovation. So when growth is not handicapped by a financial sector and a liquidity trap.
This is true.
And
And there are
innovation
pockets
has
of
been the
tremendous
key.
growth still.
And we need to focus
The Bay
on
Area.
maintaining innovation, which means maintaining investments in research, development,
And,
and basic
and
science.
education.
And
Improving
education.
our
Making
education.
sure
The
that
problem-
the
the
best
education is
people
so
that are
expensive.
here are not
Education.
shipped back out. Like there's H-1B visas. This
Yeah.
time, on the first day, there was like it was oversubscribed by 2x. So the very best students who are getting jobs, master's degrees, PhDs, like 80 to 90% of them are being shipped back. It's like training at Microsoft and sending to Apple.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
I think I want to say too,
On the other hand, all those smart people like America.
yeah,
And they go back to their own countries.
the cost of education is skyrocketing.
No.
No, they don't
So
come
the
back.
ROI on education.
They know, they go back to their own countries, but their own countries have better relations with America as a result, don't we? Don't we see?
Yeah.
Expanding.
Okay,
One
one
more
point,
than-
final point
Please,
for Paul,
please.
then I'll
Yes.
pick up my tux
I know.
before
Oh, yeah.
6. And
I'm not wearing a tux tonight.
Okay.
I'm
I'm
waiting
not
for
wearing
you.
a
Yeah. No, so one issue that I learned when we were in China, we're talking to the Chinese Investment Corporation, as Alexis will recall, and one very eye-opening thing. I am not, some kind of finance analyst, specialist or anything, but I do, from a macroeconomic perspective, I thought was very intriguing that they're waiting for the U.S. the next shoe to drop in the U.S. I mean, before they invest heavily, because they are trying to invest in the U.S. Chinese more than they have in the past. But the biggest concern, and this is from fairly reputable, right, pretty high-level people that advise the government that the liquidity crisis hasn't really reared its ugly head yet. It's going to get really bad because there are so many people holding bonds that traditionally are T-bills that are traditionally the safest instruments to invest in, right, as a consumer, as a large institutional investor, whatever you are. And there is a trap that is going to occur. Those bonds are eventually going to devalue so much because of I'm probably going to get this wrong in part, but quantitative easing by the Fed is so significant now that we still don't know how devalued those bonds will get at some point. Now, I might be totally...
Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with what you're saying. The liquidity trap being something else.
Okay,
But-
well, help me.
But nonetheless, I mean, there's a debate.
But that's an
to be had
issue.
about
There's an
it.
issue about the value of the bonds that people are holding, and that is going to have to correct itself at some
I
point.
mean,
It's
America-
going to be pain. It won't be like it was the first time around, I think, with the 08 crisis, but it's going to be bad.
I think it's a great sign when we can speak, and everyone's so excited to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just take like 5
I want to hear
iterations.
your perspective on it. What's your interest?
Right. I mean,
Well, yeah, help me, because I'm not
Okay.
necessarily
So
describing that.
the-
but just wanted to...
how do you explain the liquidity trap is when you
No, I don't
can't
think-
grow because there's been a contraction in the
Yeah, yeah.
economy and you need to expand the
How
money
do you
supply
see
to
it being
stimulate
fixed?
growth.
That was my-
Right, I mean, I think quantitative easing is a helpful way of contributing to that because it effectively expands the monetary base and gets people to invest in riskier assets.
How
So-
long do you think can the Fed actually keep up with
It
this?
can't
Well,
keep
and,
doing this.
well, the point is actually no one knows. I mean, it's up to the Fed to figure that out, but, this is an unconventional monetary policy. But there's no arbitrary limit to the size of the Fed's balance sheet, so that's actually not known.
Yeah, it's
But
You can say that it should stop at X or Y, but how do you base that argument? So
I mean, considering the fact that stimulus and quantitative easing has been going on like the past quite a few years now, do you really think like the Fed will continue this till, let's say, until 2015, 2016?
Right, okay, so first of all, I think quantitative easing in its current phase is relatively new, that they're actually making monthly asset purchases at
And
this
this is
rate.
all with increased taxes. with increased taxes,
With
that will
increased
probably
taxes.
come in. I mean, you're gonna.
I'm not sure why, okay, so there's not a relationship between Fed policy and taxes. So fiscal policy is related to taxes, but Fed policy is related to the Fed's own balance sheet. It might eventually cause inflation.
Yeah,
which is
but in
obviously
terms
bad.
of the economic growth, the both of them matter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but the Fed buying assets and monetizing parts of the debt doesn't actually have a direct relationship to taxation. But so, you know, at some point they'll have to exit that policy. But I have to say, given the depth of the financial crisis in 2008, the U.S. returned to growth fairly quickly, given the situation. Deleveraging is still going on, but we're also growing. So the economy is growing. The question is, how can you accelerate growth and actually get out of this situation where some of the financial markets still don't function, that fell apart in 2008, like the repo market we were learning about that this afternoon, event that I was at. And how do you get investors to invest in, let's say, riskier assets and not just have this unlimited demand for government bonds, which
For
are
bonds
risky.
versus.
But, okay, so you end up with then a very large government debt and a large Federal Reserve balance sheet. Those things have to be managed over time. And if you ask Carmen Reinhardt, who's maybe now in trouble, given that with the criticism of Reinhardt and Rogoff's paper, but she sees the answer in financial repression. That U.S. financial institutions will be forced to own government debt, and that inflation may erode those holdings over time, but the government will generate the revenue it needs.
So you helped explain what I
sustain
couldn't,
debt.
which is regarding the bonds.
What is your one question, the growth diagnostic question in summary?
My one growth diagnostic question in summary is what policies does U.S. need to do to promote and sustain innovation as it drives the economy?
Excellent. Okay, thank you guys, thanks for. Let's please try and come in the last review session, because I won't go through this again, but I think we'll, right after your presentation, might be a really good inflection point to take some summary messages and kind of add a little bit more to what you presented last time.
Oh,
Thank you. No worries.
Well, Alexa and I discussed it, but tomorrow morning, if possible.
I actually realized that.